posted a photograph recently that got some interest and actually generated some new followers as well. So I thought it might be interesting to sort of drill into what that photograph is actually about. There was a bit of a description along with the photograph, but I thought, seeing as that has generated some interest and also brought some new followers our way, I thought perhaps now's the time to explain a bit deeper about the whole Artecology CoCreate process and why we think it's really important. So first of all, Artecology is an eco-engineering organisation. There are now many eco-engineering organisations across the world. We were one of the very early ones, so the idea came to us in 2012. For us, it was a novel idea about creating intertidal habitat on sea defences specifically. And then it kind of very quickly started thinking about other kinds of coastal infrastructure as well. But the main thing was when you've got coastal infrastructure, concrete sea walls, whatever, keeping the sea out of urban settings, is there something you could do with that infrastructure to make it more habitable for wildlife? Because they're generally flat and plain, and there wasn't this opportunity for life to really proliferate on those kinds of infrastructures. We had this idea about creating spaces and places on those sea defences that might provide opportunities initially for things to migrate from the actual intertidal zone up onto infrastructure. And the reason that we were thinking that way is that we were thinking ahead of time. We were thinking about what was coming, and that sea level rise, coastal squeeze. Coastal squeeze is where the tide is initially going this way, and eventually it squeezes the living intertidal zone out against a hard sea defence, and eventually the tide is just going up and down that sea wall. And so the question was, I wonder if it's possible to make this vertical plane much richer in texture and pattern and form, so that things can move in and live on it. We had the idea in 2012, and by 2013 we'd installed these first things that we called verticals on that seawall, and to test them. And then over the following years they were tested and measured and studied by all sorts of universities from across the country. And all the data came back to say that they work. So that really spurred us on and made us think about other ways of doing the same thing, about different types of products that we could design and develop and test in the same way that we had done the verticals. At this point we were going up the same route as almost every other eco-engineering organisation in the world. It was a business proposition. We could see that there was a way to generate income from making products and selling them. And then after a while, it became evident to us that this wasn't the most efficient way to do this kind of work. Our primary interest in this was about wildlife and also about people too, because that's the kind of organisation we are, and it's the kind of organisation we come from, and the sort of work that we've always done. We wanted this to be about generating story linked to the science of what we're doing, so that people can have a much better understanding about these future issues that are coming: climate change, sea level rise, biodiversity loss. What does this mean for people who live, work and play in places like coastal communities? And so we started to sort of kind of fall out of love with the idea of it being a business, and then eventually we became a not-for-profit. We could see that there were flaws in the business as usual approach, and that it changed the objective in the sense that if you are a business as usual operation, then you're governed first and foremost by that number in the bottom right hand corner or bottom left hand corner of your business spreadsheet. And that's the goal. The goal is to make that number go up. And so that's all about selling more and more products and considering efficiency in relation to that number. So the efficiency of the objects that you make has a direct relationship with the number that you're making, and the number, of course, is money. And what that tends to do is to put limits on the way that you design and make the objects that you're then going to put out into the world that are for wildlife to proliferate on. There's a kind of a wobbly moment there that anyone who's working in this field will have experienced, and that is all of the data, all of the science says, coming from all of the studies, that the more texture, pattern and form you can put into these objects, eco-engineering or nature-inclusive designs, the more of that rich rugosity that you can build in, the better they work. And as I say, all of the data coming from the scientists is telling us that. Read any of the papers and it'll say it over and over again. The problem is that if you're running this kind of operation as in a business as usual kind of way, you're limited to the amount of pattern, texture and form that you can produce on these objects because of the efficiencies that you need to apply. So you need to be able to make them in big numbers, you need to be able to make them as fast as you possibly can, and that will put limitations on what you can actually do. So the science tells us that, you know, this rich pattern, rugosity, heterogeneity, you know, patterns that don't repeat, that's very difficult to do using standard production methods, which are going to be usually things like 3D printing, which gets used a lot in eco-engineering, and or casting and moulding. So sometimes, you know, a 3D printed original will be made, a mould is made of that 3D printed thing, and then you take your casts from that mould, and that's your product. It comes out of the mould and is done. What we found very early on is that there are limits on what you can do in terms of rugosity, in terms of heterogeneity, and in terms of the pattern, texture and form that you could produce using a mould, because moulds are limited, that, you know, you can't pull a mould off of an object if it's got lots of overhangs and lots of detail, because the mould gets stuck and you just can't pull it off. So it's limited. It's a limited way of working, and efficiencies of scale in terms of business as usual tells you that you've got to be able to do it by a mould, and you've got to be able to get these things off quick, and you've got to be able to get them out and rack them up and make them in their thousands and then sell them out to the world. So we decided that we're not going to play that game. What we will do is we'll look at an alternative way of not only delivering scale, but thinking about what scale actually means in the first place. So we went kind of right back to the beginning, and we had lots of conversations about what does this mean? What are we talking about when we say scale? Scaling what and what for? And then we started to drill into this new way of working, which is about engaging communities. We call it Artecology CoCreate. That's what these objects are all about. And we became a not-for-profit, as I think I said. So that changes everything. We don't want to compete with anybody. We'd much rather collaborate with other organisations that are working in the field. And it changes our approach entirely. We're not just here to make money. We're here to make the best, most bioreceptive. So, you know, bioreceptive just meaning welcoming life. We're just here to make the best objects that we can with some kind of efficiency, but we judge efficiency not just by the amount of numbers that we can produce in a day, but how efficient they are for purpose. How fit are these things for purpose? And we think that through Artecology CoCreate, engaging with communities to make objects, we're doing a number of things all at once. We are bringing these big, difficult world ecological and environmental issues to communities and saying, look, there is something you can do. It's as simple as making small objects that will become homes for wildlife. We will take those objects from you, we'll put them into the fabric of the things that we make, and by doing that, we have a way of scaling up our operation. So wherever we go, wherever these things are needed, and of course, 12 years on from when we started, we've come a long way. We have been accepted by the mainstream. So policymakers and regulators know who we are. The civil engineers know who we are, and they will commission our work to go into new sea defence schemes. The government knows who we are, so the government regulators are writing us into best practice. They're looking at the products, they see that they work because all of the data that's coming in back independently is saying that they work better than almost any other eco-engineering interventions that are out there. And of course they are. I mean, because of the kind of complexity that we're now putting into these things, with the help of communities who live in places where these things are needed. And so that is what this is all about. We are here to approach this field, this emerging field of eco-engineering, and that covers things like artificial reefs, habitats that are built into infrastructure anywhere. The vertical system, there are about 1,000 of them deployed around the UK and some in Europe as well. And we keep going, we keep experimenting with processes, with how to engage with communities, bring them on board, explaining the situation and getting them hands-on in making solutions to these big problems. And people love it. They love to know that the work that they're making is actually helping wildlife. It's the doom and gloom that's out there, and rightly so, relating to environmental issues is very difficult to cope with if you don't feel like there's actually anything you can do. And we're getting some of the social feedback from the workshops, where the CoCreate workshops where these things get made, and it's really interesting to see how people's minds are working and how their minds are changing in terms of how they see themselves in the world and the things that they can do. They're realizing a family are far more capable of producing complex objects than any 3D printer that's on the market. They have more flexibility in their fingers and hands and wrists than any 3D printer has. But the point is that outperforms any technology that's on the market. So if you work with a group of, say, 30 children from a school, or a group of families who've come to an Artecology CoCreate workshop, then effectively you've got millions of pounds worth of very, very complex tooling to be able to produce objects that are infinitely more complex than any machine that's on the market at the moment. That might change in the future, but at the moment that's how it is. And of course there are people everywhere. Every community that faces issues to do with climate change and sea level rise and these big existential problems, every place has a community, and every community is in a position to do something about this stuff. And that's the goal of Artecology CoCreate. It's very simple. We can and we are working with communities where there are infrastructure schemes that are going to be done anyway, which means that we would probably get commissioned to deliver verticals or some of the other things that we make. And we're just saying, well, let's engage with the local community to make these things better than we could normally do on our own here. By working in this way, using this process of making highly detailed, small artifacts made from ceramics, it brings up the level of detail. These are CoCreate verticals, and you can see that there's even colour, as well as texture, pattern and form, there's even colour. And that's part of some new research work that we're going to be doing, that's looking at the bioreceptivity of colour. These will be tested and researched to see if they attract any particular species, whether they attract invasive species, and can we sort of have some kind of colour code of bioreceptivity in the future, so we know what works and what doesn't. But the level of detail that you can get from these little handmade artifacts that are then put into these objects is second to none. So that's what it's all about. That is what that image is about, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. So thanks to all the new followers that we've picked up of late. I'm glad you're interested in what we do, and needless to say that if there's anyone out there that wants to work with us, we'd be absolutely delighted to collaborate with you, or to find funding for projects, etc., etc. We're always on the lookout for new partners anywhere in the world. We're only limited really by our imagination and your imagination, which means there is no limit basically to what's possible, I think. So thanks very much for following us.